Tap into the minds of the innovators and the Mavericks who challenge the status quo with new ideas, systems, and solutions. Welcome to Innovation Mavericks.
Welcome to Innovation Mavericks. My name's Greg Powell, President and CEO of Five Plan Partners, and Innovation Mavericks is a vlog we like to do to interact and have an interview process with people we feel like are really getting others to think outside the box, to be able to understand not only what's taking place immediately today, but looking into the future and from a historical standpoint. And I'm honored today to have with me Dr. Art Carden, who is a professor at Stanford University Brock School of Business, which I'm very proud to be involved with. Art has been quoted in many media sections, Forbes being one of them, as well as many others. And I was able to get on his calendar to have this interview today. And the reason I wanted to have the interview is because of his new book, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich. Outstanding book. I highly recommend it. Art, let me welcome you. And we want to talk about your new book today and get your thoughts.
All right, fantastic. Well, it's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Oh, sure. Well, I have had dialogue with you through the years and read other pieces that you have written and everything. And always you give me just a whole new insight.
Well,
So to start off with, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich. What was the inspiration for this book? Tell us about that.
So my co-author on the book is an economic historian named Deidre Nansen McCloskey.
Yes.
And she has written a trilogy of books on what she calls the bourgeois era. The first book, Bourgeois Virtues, came out in 2006. The second book, Bourgeois Dignity, came out in 2010. The third book, Bourgeois Equality, came out in 2016. And actually, not long after I joined the faculty at Stanford, we had a lunch, and she asked if I wanted to join her to write "Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich," or to write a fourth volume that kind of encapsulates her overall story and kind of helps the world see what economic historians know about how societies got rich, how the West specifically got rich, and how we're witnessing the largest mass movement out of extreme poverty in the history of the human species. They're the simple facts of economic history that I don't know that a lot of people really appreciate.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And I'm not sure people appreciate how much richer we are and how much better life is in 2020 than it was in 1820 or 1720 or 1920, or even for that matter, 1990. So we compile some data. Well, actually, Hans Rosling, the Swedish epidemiologist, compiled some data, and then we rely on a lot of that data to point out that if you go back to, say, 1980, when I was 1 year old, I was among the very, very small fraction of one-year-olds in the world who'd been vaccinated. Now, an enormous fraction of 1-year-olds have been vaccinated. If we look at things like life expectancy in the poorest countries in the world today, they're very low by American standards, very low by European standards, but they're about 150% of life expectancy in countries like England and France at the beginning of the 19th century. So even the poorest people in the world today can expect to live longer, healthier, richer lives, importantly, where they can read. And that too is something else that I think we sort of tend to take for granted.
In terms of the chapters, I love the different titles of some of your chapters. In number 8, for example, it says, in fact, none of the 7 old pessimisms make a lot of sense. Talk about that.
So people have been pessimistic for a very long time and in many different ways, and they've not been right. So you had the Malthusian pessimism, for example, that population growth was eventually going to outstrip our ability to feed ourselves. Okay. And here we are, 7+ billion people and a couple of hundred years later, and we have the highest standards of living of any generation that's come before us. The idea that natural resources are in some sense going to be a constraint on our capacity to grow and our capacity to flourish is a pessimism that I think has been refuted. Racist pessimism is something that has been refuted. And of course, racism is something that's characterized virtually every society everywhere for all of human existence. And if you look at if you look at 19th and early 20th century scientific racism, for example, there was a popular view, for example, that Europeans of specifically Northern European extraction were the only people on Earth who were capable of leading refined, cultured, high-income, healthy, wealthy, long lives. It was said of the Chinese, for example, and this is here, I'm paraphrasing one of the racists of the time. He said, in referring to Chinese workers, he said they can't outwork Americans, but they can underlive them. And we've seen a decisive refutation of the racist pessimism in the 20th and early 21st centuries, as it turns out that what matters is not what runs through your veins, not what makes up your genetic code, or not what color your skin is, or what have you, but whether or not you live in a society that values liberty, whether or not you live in a society that dignifies innovation and entrepreneurs. And so those are just two of the pessimisms that have been, I think, pretty decisively refuted by the historical record. And the pessimisms that we see going forward, environmental pessimism, for example.
Okay. Yeah, talk about those.
Yeah, so there's environmental pessimism. There's also pessimism about technology. The argument that that artificial intelligence is going to take everybody's jobs. For example, we don't think that those are particularly well justified. Again, because as societies get richer, they tend to demand more environmental amenities.
Right.
First of all. Second, we're actually dematerializing production. So we're getting more and more wealth and more value with less and less and less and less material stuff. And that's a trend that is something I think it's very important to keep in mind. When we think about something like inequality, again, so McCloskey and I make the argument, probably kind of controversially, that we don't think that inequality per se matters a whole lot. What matters is whether or not people have access to sufficient food, clothing, shelter, education, et cetera, to lead a flourishing life. And whether or not the fact that Jeff Bezos has a lot more than you or me, I don't think is morally important.
So in essence, what you're telling me is, and I've said this on more than one vlog, it's the Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And from the standpoint, through our history here, we've had these pessimisms that constantly reoccur, but the reality of it is that as we've gone forward, life has actually gotten better.
Yes. Yeah, and that's absolutely the case.
Yeah, and in your book, what would you say is the pivotal or a few of the pivotal timeframes when things really shifted? Talk a little bit about that.
So the big change happens primarily in the 18th century.
Right.
Kind of right around 1750, give or take a couple of decades. And a lot of standard explanations argue that it was nice stuff to have, like science or education or natural resources or what have you, that caused the Industrial Revolution, that caused the Great Enrichment, that caused us to get wealthy. And one of the things that we show is that it turns out that a lot of this stuff, again, was nice to have, but it doesn't explain what we're really trying to get at, which is this massive, massive, massive increase in standards of living for the poorest in the world. We argue, again, science is nice, but for the most part, technology and innovation led science in Europe in the 18th and 19th century.
That's a great point.
Yeah. So it was figuring out how stuff worked, it was seeing that something worked and then figuring out how it worked.
Right.
So one analogy that I've read in another book asks whether or not a bartender needs to know chemistry in order to be able to mix a good Manhattan, and I think we borrow that in the book, or whether, like, David Beckham needed to learn theoretical physics in order to be one of the greatest soccer players who ever lived. We've been baking bread since long before we knew how the chemistry worked.
Yes.
For example. So what mattered, we argue, was not this nice. Again, we should have more of this stuff. It's great. But these weren't the things that were decisive. What happened is that there was at least enough of a change in how we think and speak about innovators to kind of really set innovation ripping and really get things going. And we created a world in which we honor and venerate the people like Jeff Bezos, the people like Steve Jobs, the people like Bill Gates, the people like Sam Walton, who have probably done more to alleviate genuine human suffering than any people who have ever walked the face of the earth.
What inspired the title?
So the title, in one of the books, Deidre refers to the bourgeois deal as "leave me alone and I'll make you rich." And actually one day in the hallway at the Brock School of Business, I was chatting with my then dean, Howard Finch, and he asked me about the title of the book and said, we're thinking about calling it something like The Bourgeois Deal, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich. And he said, well, you should use that as the title.
Yeah.
So Dr. Finch, my former dean, is the one who suggested that we use Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich as the actual main title of the book. And fundamentally, that's what's happened as we kind of leave people alone and let them live their lives and let them innovate and let them come up with cool new stuff and let them not have to ask everybody's permission for every little thing that they want to do.
Right.
We've got lots and lots of neat stuff. And it's more than just the neat stuff. It's the increased scope for even the poorest people in the world to live meaningful, flourishing lives in ways that they haven't been able to before.
Right. So in essence, if I'm hearing you correctly, a lot of times when you have the strict laws, the regulations, and those kind of things, it actually stifles the innovation.
Absolutely.
So based on that, leave me alone and I'll make you rich. Today in this 21st century, as we move forward and people are able to work remotely and do these kind of things, do you feel like that this is the next wave? You talked about 18th century. Here we are in the 21st century, and the similarities are actually taking place.
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure what the world of remote work kind of post-COVID is going to look like. Yeah. I'm an academic, which means like I totally get the whole leave me alone thing. Like just let me think and read and write and stuff like that. But one of the things that drives innovation is conversation. Yeah. And I don't know. I worry just a little bit that protracted isolation means that you're going to have fewer of these sort of serendipitous workplace, like hallway conversations. You're running.
As I say, brainstorm. Yeah. Just a brainstorm. Yeah. Yes.
Well, just to give you just a perfect example is when you ask about the book. I just happened to I ran into my dean in the hallway and we were chatting, and he suggested that we use this as the main title for the book. And I've heard from many, many people that they say this is the best book title I've ever seen, and I can't help but agree. But I can't really take credit for it. I mean, obviously it's Deidre's phrase, and then it became the title for the book because of one of these sort of serendipitous kind of hallway running into somebody and chatting kind of moments.
What would you like to see as the rippling effect of this? In other words, you've done some incredible things, inspired students and people like myself, and there's a rippling effect that goes with that gets people motivated or inspired to take action on things. What would you like for the rippling effect of this book to be?
I would like for the book to change the degree to which we give ourselves credit for meaning well, and sort of move the dial just a little bit toward, again, kind of more esteem for results. In a sense, more. I want people to read. I want people who read the book to understand that if they're designing grocery stores for Kroger, that's feeding the hungry. If they're stitching shirts at a factory in Bangladesh, that's clothing the naked. If they're, if you're a good building contractor, for example, you are fundamentally a wealth creator doing a great thing for the world. To understand that cooperation, exchange, and innovation is the cornucopia. That's the sort of horn of plenty that has expanded so many possibilities for so many different people. I would love for people to read the book and see how what might look like mundane or not terribly important or terribly exciting tasks make a really big difference in the grand scheme of things.
That's great. So, and if I heard you correctly as well, that if you're an entrepreneur, if you own a business, and embrace it, that you're making a difference in helping others, helping lives, that there's a lot of fulfillment in that, and the rippling effect of that is big as well. And sometimes maybe that's not expressed in this this time frame that we're currently in.
Well, someone might think, I want to educate people, say, but I'm not a teacher or a writer or whatever. I'm just good at fixing brakes on cars. Well, okay, fantastic. So if you're fixing the brakes on my cars and doing a really, really good job of it, creating wealth that way, you're freeing up my time, energy, and attention to be a better teacher, better writer, etc. So, in fact, one of the articles we've written in the wake of the book being published points out that there's no way to identify literally every single person who's had a hand in the production of this, from the people who farmed the trees that became the paper to like the folks at y'all's office who have helped my wife and me, so that I can focus less on worrying about whether we have a will, for example, and more about whether or not the book's going to be good.
So, Art, let me, at the end of the book, you talk about Adam Smith revealed in the final chapter. As we start to close this vlog here, could you just elaborate on why you picked that as the topic of the chapter and where that takes us as we end the book and we go, wow, that's inspirational.
So the way that a friend of mine put it one time said, no matter how famous he is, Adam Smith is still underrated. I think a lot of people who have read Smith or who know Smith maybe know like a caricature or cartoon version of Adam Smith that allegedly extols like narrow self-interest in the way that we try to teach our kids not to behave. But Smith, the more I learned about Smith, the more I come to believe that his most important book was actually The Theory of Moral Sentiments, the first edition of which was published in 1759, and the final edition of which was published in 1790, rather than The Wealth of Nations. So Theory of Moral Sentiments, I argue, is kind of the key to understanding the Smith of The Wealth of Nations. The Smith of The Wealth of Nations is a key to understanding 19th century political economy. And if you understand all of that, everything sort of starts to make sense. There's a fantastic passage in Wealth of Nations in which Smith argues that we appeal not to the humanity of the butcher, the baker, the brewer in order to get our dinner, but to their self-interest. We refer to their own interest.
Okay.
And a lot of people take that as kind of a Smith's endorsement of selfishness, but I think what he's really getting at there is that if we want people to do for us, we have to be prepared to do for them. And in the case of the butcher, the baker, the brewer, they've got their own lives to live. They've got their own families to feed. They could have an infinite line of people who want bread, who want meat, who want beer. And they've got to come up with some way to decide, okay, who gets what I have to offer. And if we want the butcher, the baker, the brewer to feed us, we can't simply show up and say, okay, you're obliged to feed me. We have to make them better off.
Yeah.
In some way, better off as they choose to define it, because they too are equal and dignified moral agents. And I think adopting that perspective, this sort of radical equality, this idea that it doesn't matter who your dad was, it doesn't matter what family you came from, it doesn't matter what fraternity you're part of or something like that, that everyone is fundamentally equal and everybody fundamentally has the right to say no to any offer.
Yeah.
And that, we argue, is the match that sort of lit the fire of the Great Enrichment.
Great explanation. It's a fantastic book. Leave me alone and I'll make you rich. I highly recommend it as a great read, not only from a historical perspective, but to relate to today and what's going on. Art, I can't thank you enough.
Sure, hey, thank you.
Your insight is always invaluable to me. Sanford University and Brock School of Business is very fortunate, and those students are too, to have you there to lecture and give insight. And as an alum of Sanford University, I am thrilled that you are there. So with that, sir, we thank you. Congratulations on the book. I can't wait to read the reviews. And anytime you want to run ideas our way, please let me know.
Certainly.
This has been Innovation Mavericks. We thank you for joining us. And hopefully you've gotten some great ideas and understand the importance of innovation in our economy and society today. Have a great week.